This is our last, and in many ways, our most important panel. What can we do? So it's my great pleasure to introduce Martin Flaherty, who will moderate the panel, and who is the Leitner Family Professor of Law and founding co-director of the Leitner Center for International Law and Justice at Fordham Law School. He's also a visiting professor at Princeton University. His publications focus upon constitutional law and history, foreign affairs, and international human rights. Please welcome panel 3 and Martin Flaherty.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Okay. Thank you. And actually, since this was written, I'm also visiting at Columbia Law School, where we were talking about East Turkestan this morning. So it's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be here. And indeed, I would like to thank Roosevelt House, Human Rights Watch, and our all mutual friend Tung Biao for putting this together. So thank you very much. Somebody mentioned the great Jerry Cohen earlier today. And to channel Jerry in these kinds of proceedings, he would generally end the day by saying, we've heard a lot of interesting and disturbing things, but the question is, what should we do? What should we do as students? What should we do as members of international civil society? What should we do as academics? What should governments do? And to that end, we have a phenomenal panel to speak to what should be done, what can be done, what is effective, what is not effective with regard to the issues we've been hearing about with regard to the genocide in Xinjiang. So our speakers will be in this order: Akram Karam, who is a native Uyghur and senior program officer at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'll keep these introductions short. Next, followed by Elizabeth Lynch, who is an attorney practicing in New York and is founder of China Law and Policy and has written extensively for publications you are all familiar with. Then Amelia Pang, who is an award-winning investigative journalist of China and Uyghur descent. She too has published in an array of journals with which you are all familiar. And then finally, my good friend, Sophie Richardson, who is China director at Human Rights Watch and is fresh back from Geneva, I believe, who will tell us a little bit about that. So we will follow the similar format we've been following the whole day. So let me turn things over to our speakers, first to Akram.
Thank you. First of all, I'm very honored to be here today with those great panelists and other ones that we have had in earlier discussions. I just wanted to also thank you for the Hunter College and then my friend Tung Biao for putting this great event together here today. I am going to focus on specifically on the question of, what should we do? I think one of the key topics that it's going to remain long and then really tough fight for a long term would be disinformation, how to countering CCP's disinformation and propaganda. Actually, this topic is actually the very first topic was asked by our first, moderator in the first panel, Isaac, and we have had different panels just touched on the different parts. So what I'm going to say very briefly is first, I'm going to touch base on the CCP's the history of disinformation, and secondly, how it's that creating challenge both for its domestic audience, international audience, as well as Uyghur diaspora community. And then the third one, I just wanted to have a forward-looking. In previous panel discussions, we have had a very heartbreaking, sad family stories from my fellow Uyghurs, brothers and sisters. I would like to, using this opportunity, do more of positive thinking, and then bringing up to our positivity and continuous fight against disinformation, against the genocide going on. So with that, if I can go first, the CCP has a long history of taking this disinformation propaganda as the key work in the system's existence. When they have had the fight as far as back to the KMT times, they have been using this disinformation propaganda as a key approach. They even used, after Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan, they have been using lots of speakers and leaflets to go kind of do this propaganda, disinformation work about what happened and what's going on in Taiwan. And when it comes to the Uyghur, that's the long history. They are really good at it. And not necessarily it's been working all the time though, because we have a saying in Uyghur, hakikat igilidu sunmaydı. Now, meaning in English is the truth can be bent, but it will never break. So today, whether if it's the Uyghur genocide or it's the people separation of the people in Tibet or Hong Kong situation, we are speaking the power of the truth. We're saying that the power of the truth is with us, and I'm pretty much sure that in both in the long term, as well as in the short to medium terms, we're going to win because we have the power of the truth. So with that, when it comes to this Uyghur disinformation thing, there's just three words, three political terms I'd like to just use as an example. The first one, the poverty elevation in the Uyghur region, East Turkestan. We have different panelists spoke about how rich our homeland East Turkestan is, from oil to rare earth, gas, precious metals, everything. And you talk about poverty elevation and that 1/6 of China, that vast resource-rich region, that is disinformation. The second thing is disinformation, targeting the Chinese audience, ethnic Chinese inside China on Uyghur issues. The two-child policy, that is disinformation. Why? Because it was not Uyghurs or others that made the 1.4 or more than 1 billion population, or that is not all other ethnic groups that they made this population crisis. And when it comes to this two-child policy, a lot of, unfortunately, doesn't knowing the fact, the people, Han Chinese people, they think that, oh, why minorities can have two children? Why we Han Chinese are only allowed one? Just look at the proportion. Look at the, the ratio of those ethnic makeup. It was not Uyghurs or Tibetans or other ethnic groups that they made this problem. So that's how this information starts. And also, when you start talking about our situation, or ethnic identity in the context of the CCP, they call it minority. We were never minorities in our homeland. Tibetans were never a minority in Tibet. We Uyghurs were never a minority in East Turkestan. That's a political disinformation term. So that's how they're really good at, using the disinformation, targeting its own, domestic audience, as well as, reaching out to the international propaganda. The second thing is I'll also just kind of touch base on those challenges of the CCP's disinformation. We have other panelists, as well as, keynote speaker Nuri also mentioned that a lot of Chinese people inside the Chinese regime, they're unaware of what's happening there because of the disinformation, as well as, severe, surveillance and information control. But that's the one part, and second part is because of this disinformation, there are a lot of people, not only Uyghurs or others that in the Western free world, like they're also confused with the disinformation the CCP is spreading because they're so good at it. So that's that part. And then the third part, this disinformation is creating a challenge is even among the Uyghur diaspora communities. When it comes to this kind of disinformation, CCP used disinformation as a way of weapon attacking Uyghur advocacy groups, activists in exile. And what's happening is that, look, we have millions of people in concentration camps today, and an active genocide is going on. We Uyghurs estimate that I think in diaspora we have over 1 million, Uyghurs in diaspora. But if you look at those, testifiers, the people who provided testimonies and told their stories about, what's happening to their beloved ones, their college classmates, their friends, neighbors, the number is probably maximum 5,000 to 8,000. I think in a way, this is how the CCP's disinformation is winning. How it's winning, it's creating fear. It's also creating a kind of distrust. And the CCP is also very good at, in my view, using those local language, Uyghur diaspora community social media to attack those activists and very credible Uyghur groups. That's the challenge on that part, but going forward, and I think I also would like to touch base on the positive part. Despite this disinformation efforts, if you look at, starting from 2016 all the way now, actually there has been so many positive change and, progress has made on the Uyghur genocide, specifically on the Uyghur advocacy when it comes to international avenues. The two laws passed in the United States, the Uyghur Human Rights Act, as well as Forced Labor Prevention Act, that's a success. And I think so far we have about 11 parliamentaries, nation state parliamentaries around the world have passed resolution recognizing the genocide. And that is a success. And I think when it comes to the Uyghur community, what is also a success is the Independent Uyghur Tribunal that was held, in England, London last year. And for that tribunal, they themselves actually invited the Chinese Communist Party just to come up with their, testimonies, come up, just being open and then speak about it. They didn't do that. And that's, I think, is a winning. And then today we are sitting here with those, panelists, as well as activists and advocates from the Uyghur community. And doing this kind of work, to me, is a success. This is a success. I know this is a long time work, but we are going to continue to this fight. And with that, I would like to just close my comments with the latest update on the CCP's disinformation propaganda war when it comes to the Uyghur region. Last Friday, the Uyghur region's party committee held its 15th standing meeting. On that 15th work meeting, the 15th plenary meeting, they used the guidance received from Xi Jinping in his visit to the East Turkestan Uyghur region in July. And they come up with 15 key working points for a long-term work of the Uyghur region. And on those 15 key point guidelines, first of all, was always, which has started in 2010, since 2010, is continue this high pressure crackdown. And second one actually is, continue to work and strengthen foreign propaganda work, which is disinformation. And if we look at the CCP, Uyghur regions, the CCP parts work there in 2021, it's so interesting that they held 68 press conference, foreign press conference at the MFA, 68. To my knowledge, I don't think I have ever seen the regional government held 68 foreign press conference in a year. I think that speaks to how well those Uyghur advocacy groups and works have been done internationally, and how the international groups has been responding. And I think, and also World Uyghur Congress and other groups at the UN and other places, they also held, like starting about 2 years ago, photo exhibitions of what's happening in East Turkestan. And the CCP actually followed their footsteps. They too come up with their photo exhibitions, and they also come up with those short videos saying how the cotton work in the Uyghur region is free of forced labor, using those Uyghur faces and image. And there, in a way, sometimes I see that the CCP is kind of winning, but again, the truth can be bent, but it will never break. And sometimes they're also kind of reacting to this great work of the Uyghur activists and advocacy groups, human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Freedom House, and others doing. Just want to stop here and then happy to share my recommendations. What should we do later?
Great. Thanks very much. Next, we'll hear from Elizabeth Lynch.
Hello? Oh, hi. So I just want to thank Roosevelt House, Human Rights Watch, and Tung Biao for putting on this really timely and important conference, and also just thank all our Uyghur friends who have talked about their stories and what has happened to their families. It's not easy to talk about, but it's important for the world to hear. So thank you for that. So as we mentioned, this panel is what should we do? And before I delve into what should we do, I think the first question is, do we have to do anything at all? Do we have a legal responsibility to actually do something? We have a moral responsibility, but legally, is there something there for us to do? And I know there's been a lot of conversation and discussion in the advocacy community and the world at large. Is this crimes against humanity? Is this genocide? What difference does that make? And I think what's really fortunate is that when it comes to what should we do, that distinction actually doesn't matter. Because under international law, you are required to do something. In 2005, the UN World Summit Agreement was issued, and it was signed by all the member UN states. And that requires that if you believe there's genocide or crimes against humanity happening, you have a responsibility to protect that persecuted population. It doesn't make a distinction for genocide. It doesn't say you have to do more to protect. It's both the same for genocide and crimes against humanity. And you don't have to wait around for the United Nations to tell you that it's crimes against humanity or that it's genocide. You, as an independent state, can decide that. And once you've decided that, such as the United States and some other countries, then this legal obligation for the responsibility to protect takes over. So we do have a responsibility to do something. And the thing that I would just like to briefly talk about is about Uyghur refugees and what we can do to help them. And before I talk about that, I do want to just talk a little bit about the United States history of taking in refugees. And I think when we go back to looking at World War II and how the United States rejected so many Jews from fleeing Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, I think that should remind the United States that we have even more of an obligation to help those now to make up for our past. We turned away boatloads of Jews. We refused to pass laws that would have allowed us to take in more Jewish children. And we had very small quotas to take in people from Europe, and we didn't even fill that very small quota. And in fact, Secretary Blinken last year apologized for what this Department of State had done during World War II, which was basically closing the doors to Jews who we knew were most likely going to die. So I think that's just some of the history to put in perspective in terms of how we should be treating refugees and victims of genocide. And fortunately, the Biden administration has recently given priority status for Uyghurs to come into the United States. And what that means is that they have a shorter route to get into the United States. They no longer have to prove that they're being persecuted individually. It's just now assumed that if you're Uyghur or another Turkic Muslim from China, that you are being persecuted. And that's really great that they did that on paper, but in reality, it doesn't really change the situation, because for most people seeking asylum and refugee status in the United States, you're talking about a 4 to 5 year wait. So I think when we talk about priority status, I think we need to also talk about giving priority to actually putting resources and funding our asylum and refugee system. And I do think that the Uyghur genocide provides a really unique opportunity to maybe seek out that funding. Immigration is really a difficult issue in DC, but what's not difficult is that both parties, there's bipartisan support to stop the genocide and crimes against humanity happening in Xinjiang. And I think this provides a really great opportunity that whenever there is lobbying and advocacy going on Capitol Hill, it shouldn't just be about the words to protect Uyghurs. It should actually be bills that also include funding to our refugee and asylum system. So I just kind of want to make that point. Otherwise, all we have is rhetoric and it's not saving lives. And I think the other big issue in terms of refugees is not just the ones who are trying to get into the United States, but also Uyghurs who end up in other countries like Thailand and Turkey. These are countries that are more economically beholden to China, and so therefore often succumb to their pressure to send back the Uyghurs to China. And I think what's really interesting is that the UN report that came out a week and a half ago, while it didn't really declare crimes against humanity, it said there may be crimes against humanity. The one thing that it did make really, really clear is that countries should not be sending Uyghurs back to China. And instead that they should be providing them with humanitarian support, medical support, psychological support. So even the UN with its watered down report noted that this shouldn't be happening. But even with the UN saying that, is Thailand not going to send Uyghurs back? Is Turkey not going to send Uyghurs back? They still have the pressure. That report doesn't take away the pressure. And I think this provides a really unique opportunity for the United States to take a leadership role in creating some kind of global network where countries who don't have as much pressure from the Chinese government take those Uyghurs from Turkey, from Thailand, from Malaysia. And I know during the 1930s, the United States actually did convene a conference called the Avion Conference about talking about how the world should respond to Jewish refugees. And Unfortunately, that conference was completely unsuccessful because the United States did not agree to take in more Jewish refugees and didn't agree to go outside of its quotas. And so no other country followed, no other country increased their quotas as a result. But I think we should look to do something, well, not similar, but something like having a conference now, having a global conference where the United States takes a leadership role and finds a plan to get Uyghurs out of these other countries into more liberal democracies that won't succumb to those pressures. And not only would that help save lives, but it would also show China that Western liberal democracies are united, and in fact, other countries are willing to work within that system. So I think that's something that the United States and other liberal democracies should be thinking about. And again, that's not going to stop the genocide in Xinjiang, but what it will do is rescue some of the people who have made it out. So with that, I just want to end it and turn it over to my next panelist.
Just a quick footnote, one of the few prominent Americans who was pushing for opening the doors to Jewish refugees in the 1930s used to live in this house. It was Eleanor Roosevelt. So let me now turn things over to Amelia. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. It is really heartening to hear about all the legal avenues we have today. But when global governments are slow to respond and slow to enforce legislation banning forced labor products from entering our ports, what can the average individual do to stop the Uyghur genocide? That's the million-dollar question. While I don't think there's a silver bullet that can end the genocide tonight, I do think individual people, like each of us sitting here today, have more power than most of us may realize. Because Beijing responds to financial pushback, and we can make this forced labor system less profitable for the Chinese government. Of course, there's always going to be domestic Chinese companies sourcing from these camps, and there's probably not much we can do about that. But I believe individuals like me and you have a lot of sway over Western corporations. How so? Because today, major brands dedicate a pretty big budget to social listening, which is the process of identifying and assessing what people are saying about your brand across social media platforms, from Twitter to Reddit to Instagram. And if there's significant criticism about anything, whether it's a dissatisfaction with your product or perhaps the perception that you are not doing enough to weed Uyghur forced labor out of your supply chain, then it's very likely that that tweet and that Instagram comment will get documented in an internal report for a high-ranking executive at the company, even if you only have 100 followers and your post received no retweets or likes. Really? Why is that? You might be wondering. Because the reason why corporations invest money in social listening is because it gives them an opportunity to get ahead and take preventative action before an issue like forced labor and genocide becomes intertwined with that brand and permanently damages the company. So a lot of companies pay attention to not only the panelists sitting here today who have thousands and tens of thousands of followers, they also pay attention to social media posts from the average person with little to no following at all, because the average individual represents the public's perception of your brand. And if there's sustained conversation on social media about your company's association with Uyghur forced labor, or at least a perception that you could be sourcing from forced labor because it's unclear if your raw materials are coming, it's unclear where they're coming from, then that company is going to be more compelled to clean up their supply chain and strengthen their factory audits so that they can say they know for sure that they're not sourcing from manufacturers associated with the Uyghur labor transfer program or suppliers with connections to the camps. So what actions should our tweets be asking corporations to do to strengthen their factory audits and clean up their supply chain? To be really sure that your raw materials are not manufactured by Uyghur forced laborers, you need to make sure that your manufacturers are actually subcontracting where they say they're subcontracting to, and that factory and all of their factories have no association with any prison camps. When I was in Shanghai in early 2019, I followed trucks leaving labor camps and watched them with my own eyes drop off shipments at manufacturers that produce products for some major global brands. One of them was a manufacturer that was listed as an official supplier on Apple's website. When I spoke to Apple, they said they have a strict policy that forbids their suppliers from sourcing from forced labor, and that that particular supplier works with a lot of brands. You don't know that that truck was dropping Apple products off at the facility. It's true, I don't know. I couldn't see what was inside the shipment. But shouldn't it be troubling to you that your supplier has a relationship with a labor camp? It should be troubling, and with our social media usage, we should be starting asking brands to update their contracts with suppliers to start reflecting that. If journalists can find these hidden connections between labor camps and suppliers that are making products for multi-billion dollar global companies, then these companies have the resources to find out this information too. So why not rewrite your contracts with manufacturers to say, hey, if you want a long-term relationship with a major global brand like us, it's important for you to not have any relationship with labor camps, prisons, extra-legal detention centers, or factories participating in the Uyghur labor transfer program. It's not just that we don't want you to use those facilities to make our stuff. We don't want you to use forced labor facilities for any of your customers, because that goes against our corporate ethics. And we will be periodically sending investigators to follow the freight trucks that leave your facility to see if they go to any labor camps. You know, something like this is just a change in a contract that won't cost Western companies much money, but it will send a loud message to the factories and to the Chinese government that their forced labor system may not be that profitable for much longer. This can start with a couple of tweets and Facebook posts from the people sitting here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for an empowering talk. And finally, we'll hear from Sophie Richardson.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm going to save longer thanks for when we wrap up, but also, Amelia, can I just say, I am so tired of having companies call and say, but it's hard to know where our supply chain goes. And you think, no, what's hard is being arbitrarily detained. You have an obligation to find out where your stuff is coming from. Stop whining, go do your homework. I don't know what your compliance officers do all day. And I wanted to say a little bit about the work that we're trying to do in Geneva with a view towards actually moving towards some sort of investigative mechanism. But I want to do that partly to pick up on some of the very powerful points that Zubaida and Magnus and Ilshad were making in the previous panel. You know, the international human rights system exists because states either fail to protect people or themselves abuse them. And you know, that architecture says that there's an obligation to actually hold people accountable. You know, so as we talk about combating disinformation or how to help refugees or how to motivate companies to do the right thing, I think it's also important to talk about, you know, how intergovernmental bodies, particularly within the United Nations system, typically, and I use that term very broadly, we could have a long conversation about the variations on this theme, respond to atrocity crimes. And that is to put together an investigative mechanism with a view towards actually prosecuting people and raising the price for committing gross human rights violations. So I thought maybe what I could do is just tell you a little bit about our conversations with governments on Wednesday, sort of before the report came out, as opposed to Thursday after the report came out. That's a little bit of a stylized distinction. On Wednesday, governments were still saying to us, we're not talking about this until the report actually comes out. We're not going to speculate. We're not going to even brainstorm various pathways to accountability. And many of these pathways, it's important to note, run through the Human Rights Council, which is an inherently political body, right? It is a body made up of member states. And that makes the challenge that much harder. But the arguments that we cycle through first and foremost are that past tactics haven't worked, right? That Beijing has clearly internalized for decades now that the worst case scenario is to have to sit through a bilateral human rights dialogue. And having sat through some of them myself, you know, yes, they are painful and tedious, you know, but does that actually cost Chinese government officials anything? Nope. And that's why we think we see progressively worse violations. We have to move on to other tactics. Those don't work. So second, establishing an actual investigative mechanism is what the international human rights system does. This is what it is meant to do. And I think it bears mention that in the wake of the horrific attacks on Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, it was actually, to somebody's question earlier today, it was actually the European Union and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation that led the way in the establishment of an investigative mechanism. Let's not forget that those two bodies, which between them must represent something like 60 governments, were the ones who said accountability is the right way to go. Let's see that play get run again. Third, I think we could have a long conversation about the report that has finally been released by the Office of the High Commissioner. I think it is a very strong documentation and analysis. I would particularly encourage everyone to read the analysis of the counterterrorism and extremism legislation. I think the report was written the way it was to hand governments something they could really, really rely on. By the way, Akram, my favorite footnote in the report is number 10, because it actually cites a number of those hideous press conferences as evidence of Chinese government efforts to whitewash atrocity crimes. I think and government said to us starting on Thursday, yeah, we can't argue with this. And for all of us in the room who spent years and years and years documenting these violations, one is a little bit offended that what we were doing somehow wasn't quite good enough, but it matters. It matters to have a UN report that chronicles these abuses in this way and reaches the conclusions that it does. But I think probably the most powerful argument, the one where governments really start thinking about how they actually have to respond now, is to say that a failure to push for accountability in the face of crimes of this scope and scale is to embolden more and worse, and not just inside China, but around the world. And we find it a fairly powerful argument now to be able to point to Chinese government human rights violations in other countries, and indeed the Chinese government's assault on the international human rights system as motivating factors to get in the game. I think this is where we see some of the more public unwillingness to challenge the Chinese government change, at least behind closed doors. And governments will say to us, yes, we have these problems. We know that we need to respond to it and actually find ways of pushing back, because this is only getting worse. I think Beijing's response to the report, and particularly the very hostile attacks both on the Office of the High Commissioner and on the special procedures mandate holders who published another statement a few days later, is also causing a certain amount of alarm and momentum where there might not otherwise be within the UN human rights system, because that's the Chinese government really dismissing the system as a whole in very hostile and personal terms. They're using the kind of language that if a Chinese diplomat actually said that out loud on the floor of the Human Rights Council, the president would have to intervene and shut that down. And a number of people and organizations have weighed in to make this point. So from our perspective, the game plan is really about persuading some current Human Rights Council member states to actually put forward a resolution that would formally bring the report onto the Council's agenda with a view towards establishing an investigative mechanism. I think my colleagues who work on these issues worldwide are well, they're not astonished anymore. They've been in the China trenches for a while now, but I think they're astonished at how much effort simply getting a report put on the agenda is, without even asking states to take a position on the substance of it or what ought to happen next. And I think at this point, it really is a question of whether governments actually have the guts at this particular moment to step forward and do that. But as we've said to them, if not now, when? And if you really believe that no state is above the law, it's time to go in this direction, because 30 years of bilateral human rights dialogues are part of what's brought us to this point. Thanks.
Thank you, and I'd like to commend all the speakers for leaving a lot of time for questions. So let me assert the prerogative of the chair and get things going. And it picks off or jumps off of what Sophie said, though it applies to everyone, and I'd be interested to hear what you had to say, which is, you know, are we at a moment of truth turning point with regard to China and human rights? The depressing part of the story is what we've been hearing. China's become ever more powerful economically and in all sorts of other ways, that engagement hasn't worked, that it's just emboldened China and created a sense of impunity. Conversely, the more optimistic, if you will, part of the story is China is grossly and ham-fistedly overplaying its hand by doing nothing short than creating a genocide within its borders. And that is finally, perhaps at last, producing some sort of pushback. So which is going to win, Chinese economic power or the world's revulsion at these gross violations of China's international legal obligations?
I really have to get new glasses. I wish I could say that it is gross revulsion. That's some of it. But I also think governments have, first of all, you know, at the same time that we've watched, you know, that we've all watched these horrors unfold across the Uyghur region, I think governments and people around the world have also watched, you know, the Chinese government absolutely destroy civic life in Hong Kong. They have lived the effects of Chinese government suppression of information and free speech around COVID and lived the consequences of that. You know, there are governments that are clearly in need of financing or vaccines, and they get those, and the bridge collapses a year later. They find out the vaccines aren't effective, right? I mean, even the governments that are, you know, that really need any of the kind of financial support that Beijing can offer, I think are increasingly aware that that is not a simple and magnanimous proposition anymore. You know, there's also the reality that the zero COVID policy has done, you know, has wrought incredible harm across the Uyghur region, but also across the rest of the country, to the economy. This has caused problems for lots of people around the world, first and foremost for people inside China. I think governments are sort of looking at the current situation and thinking, this is not what we were sort of sold on or the vision, and it has potentially nasty consequences for us either already or in the future. And I think from the perspective of an advocacy organization, part of our challenge is sort of harnessing this concern and these criticisms and turning it towards a positive human rights result, you know, both for people who are affected by this nightmare, but also for the international human rights system, and with a view towards showing the Chinese government that it can't get away really with any of these kinds of violations.
Okay. I think, you know, the answer relies on whether the CCP is going to win or lose on this case. The answer relies on the international community, specifically the communities of the free world, the communities, states of the democratic, you know, world. And if we continue to go to the 1.4 billion China market, you know, continue to go to China's economic political leverage, CCP is going to win. But this is a war against, you know, humanity. It's not a war only against Uyghurs or Tibetans or, you know, Chinese Christians or Hong Kongers. This is what's happening there is not only genocide, we also said it's a crime against humanity. Humanity, all of us sitting here, all of us listening on the, you know, virtual platform, regardless of our color, religion, ethnic background. So as far as we can stay united on this fight, I think, you know, it's not up to the CCP, it's up to us, it's up to the free world to, you know, win and then make a determination on this cause.
And one more question for me, and then we'll turn it over both to people online and people in the room. Since we are in the United States, what more can the US government be doing, especially given the very rare bipartisan support for action on this issue.
I mean, just to go back to talking about refugees and asylum seekers and including, making the system faster. I also think a lot of the laws that are being passed, the forced labor, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act and other laws are coming with penalties. And I do think that using some of those penalties, those monetary penalties, to support Uyghur asylum seekers, because even if you get into the country, it doesn't guarantee you a job or anything like that. And there is a lot of support that needs to be given to asylum seekers and refugees. One thing I do want to mention that's kind of small is just doing more translations. So I think Magnus on the previous panel talked about letting the Chinese people decide whether or not they want this genocide committed in their name. And if all of your information is in English and not in Chinese, it makes it harder for them to the extent they can break through the firewall, to read those things. I know the UN report hasn't been translated yet, and I'd be curious when that's going to happen. And the Uyghur Tribunal judgment, which is really an amazing judgment. If people haven't read it, it's very legally, I think, sound. That hasn't been translated yet. The New Yorker piece that came out last year, I guess, that was translated into Chinese, and I think that's really good. But this is really expensive to translate things into Chinese, and I think it should also be translated into Uyghur to let Uyghurs know that there are people out there, that the rest of the world is paying attention and stuff. And I do think maybe putting some funding toward translations of these documents could go a long way. I mean, it's a small thing, it's not going to end the genocide, but I do think that is important.
I think another part of this issue is the U.S. needs to invest more in American manufacturing, not only in the U.S., but also in other countries. Maybe we can't completely cut off economic ties to China, but we can even it out a little bit more, because as many of you may know about the Made in China 2025 plan, which is China's plan to strategically transition away from cheap manufacturing to high-tech goods. And that's something the global economy is going to need a lot of in the near future. So that's really strengthening everyone's ties to China. And until more economies begin producing these tech products, it's hard for governments to fully take serious action.
Do we have any online queries, or then we'll just take queries here? So in front first, you.
Hello, okay. I'm Kazi. I'm from Hunter. Mr. Haas, so I'd like to be the devil's advocate or the skunk in the garden. Our keynote speaker said there was a responsibility for Western liberal democracies to protest against these unjust things. And although I agree with that, I'd like to point out that many of these Western liberal democracies are being besieged by far right-wing forces, including in the US, France, Germany, on and on. There's also the fact that America has participated in or collaborated with mass atrocity crimes. Some that come to mind is Chile. Yeah. So given all this history, far right-wing US collaboration in mass atrocities, as well as the fact that the UN is very bureaucratic and barely get things done, what optimism should people have in light of these, that things will get better and there will be accountability for the injustices that the CCP has committed?
Maybe I can try to respond to that question. Again, looking at the Uyghur cause and then how the United States has been, the very far front, strong supporter of the Uyghur, situation. It's true, there are things, exist, as you said, in the United States and elsewhere. But I don't think that, United States didn't lose on supporting the Uyghur situation. It's, again, when it comes to the Uyghur and China issue, this is a very bipartisan issue, and then the two parties come very strongly support it. And I think I'm still, staying hopeful that the United States will continue to lead on this fight against, the human rights issues, religious freedom issues, or the genocide in East Turkestan. And I think that's why the CCP has been keep worrying and then staying at night awake, because we read in the news that they have been submitting 2 correction lists to the U.S. government when it comes to about bilateral relations, and we read in the news that one actually is about those Magnitsky sanctioned list. That's keeping them awake at night. So if I can just, with my answer to that, if I can answer to your first question, what the United States can do, the government, I think U.S. government, the current one, continue to expand its sanction list on specifically the Uyghur human rights issues or other issues related to Hong Kong or Tibet as well. We have this new party secretary in Uyghur region. He should be on the very top list of the new list of the sanctioning. And also the Chinese government, the U.S. government should also look at other stakeholders who are involved in this genocidal ethnic policies. And I also think that maybe they should also consider sanctioning or blacklisting those Chinese intellectuals, like Ilshad Hassan, he stated earlier, like those scholars who are very pro-CCP. There's nothing wrong for them to be pro-CCP, but they're also on the far front of the disinformation. There are some Chinese scholars, even from the state affiliated organizations, they should be considered as out blacklisted, because they're promoting those disinformation. And with that, if I can just use 2 minutes of my recommendations, what should we do when it comes to the countering disinformation? I know that this Uyghur issue has been picked up as a kind of case study for some human rights classes in the United States, to my knowledge. When it comes to disinformation, how about we bring this Uyghur disinformation, CCP's disinformation campaign to journalism schools, the journalism studying subject matter students, to talk about using as a case. And that's one recommendation, maybe we can think about it. And the second one is like, when it comes to this disinformation, especially on social media, on Uyghur activists, advocacy groups, or what's happening in East Turkestan. About 2 years ago, we successfully in the United States started labeling those Chinese state official medias as Chinese state official medias. How about we also approach this on YouTube channels or other video channels, stating that these are also coming out those from state media as are Chinese affiliated. And then the third way is when it comes to this kind of disinformation and attack on activists and then advocacy groups, how about a unified approach from a cross movement like Hong Kongers, Tibetans, and Chinese dissidents reaching out to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter together, talking about what's happening as a disinformation against a particular activist or organization and groups. And another one is like, how about forming, similar to Coalition Against Uyghur Forced Labor, how about forming a working group on countering Chinese disinformation by human rights groups, CSOs, NGOs in diaspora? And as well as, I think one of the key issues in this countering disinformation in the long term is specifically to making those reports available in other language. I know that our other panelists said it very clearly. I think number one language issue other than English should be Chinese. Because yes, it's true that those Chinese people inside the CCP, the Great Firewall may not have access to those information. But what about those Chinese diaspora? What about those Chinese speaking people in free world? That's the key issue, and then it's really important. And how about also start translating those reports and engagements in Spanish speaking world, because Spanish is one of the 5 UN language, officially recognized UN language. How about in Arabic language? And how about in language in Indonesia and Malaysia, and they're like major language? I know that we have Uyghur groups that they have been very successfully doing this translation, but just translation I think is only one step. But the next step is just promotion, starting to reaching out and then, delivering this message to those audience would be really important.
Yes, Professor.
Thank you. Just a short comment to my question, if I may. Thank you. Just a very short comment. I was very impressed with, I'm not an American, but the Americans have a UN ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield, descendant of slaves, who was appointed the ambassador to the UN. And she did a 10-minute speech on this issue, to the crimes that we, the United States, have been involved in the past, make it impossible for us to speak up, and why it should mean the contrary. We should be speaking up more because we know what this is about. That was her comment. It's very powerful. I really recommend it. Her speech early on in her tenure at the United Nations. Thank you.
Yes, gentleman in the front, and then in the back. So, yeah, you first. The gentleman there. Thank you.
Okay, so earlier there was some mention made about the process with the Rohingya going in Myanmar. But I mean, my opinion is that it still hasn't really helped them at all. And the process has been going on over 5 years now, or even longer, even though there is I think a genocide investigation and everything going on. But the situation is just as abysmal for the Rohingya as it was 5, 6, 7 years ago. So, I mean, even if there is a process going to occur about Uyghurs, is it actually going to help anything in the near to mid future?
I mean, first of all, you are correct. I mean, I would commend you to Human Rights Watch's work on Myanmar for the latest information about, the state, for example, of camps for Rohingya inside Bangladesh. And the lack of support for the communities there. So on some level, is it making an immediate difference to people's daily lives? We could have a long debate about whether how much that matters. It's not the only form of redress one would want to push for a community. I mean, obviously, we've talked about different kinds of relief. International justice, my colleagues who work on things like war crimes tribunals will tell you, are painfully slow and frustrating. And there are national avenues available as well. I mean, one could take certain kinds of cases here in the US or in states that have universal jurisdiction statutes and try to push for those there. But the core idea on some level is communicating to Chinese government officials that they as individuals might actually have to face some kind of justice for their complicity in repression. And part of the idea is to communicate to them that they might not want to do that anymore, that they might want to step away from those policies. They might want to, not be the scholars whose work is being drawn on. They might not want to be the camp guards. They might not want to be, tick on down the list. It is tough to know how the prospect of these mechanisms would affect the calculations of any given individual. But I think on some level, we all agree that we behave in certain ways because we know that if we behave in other ways, there might be unpleasant consequences for us. And just going back to the point we were talking about earlier that I think Magnus and Zubair and Ilshad were trying to make, is that there hasn't been a real prospect of negative deterrent consequences for Chinese government officials for committing human rights violations. And now we're in a time of targeted individual sanctions or sanctions on government entities. And I think the prospect of actually prosecuting people, and I have to say, I was sitting here listening to you talk and thinking about, somebody like Chen Chuanguo being thought of on par with, other people who've been prosecuted for atrocity crimes. That is not an idea that Xi Jinping would like, that that Chen Chuanguo goes in the same category as Chucky Taylor, right? And I think that is an idea worth pursuing to deter people from engaging in crimes.
Yeah.
So I believe Mr. Karam, is that your name? Okay. So in the beginning, you were talking about like Chinese disinformation surrounding the Uyghur situation. Like, I mean, here in the US, we often use like national security as like excuses for like human rights violations. So what form does like this Chinese propaganda for the Uyghur situation, like what form does it take? Is it mostly like fear mongering, saying, oh, we have to put all these Uyghurs in like concentration camps to like prevent crime? Or is it like saying, oh, Xinjiang is like a really like peaceful place. There's nothing going on. What form is it like taking?
I think some part of your question actually is a very exact disinformation of the CCP that they're trying to spread, which is, Xinjiang, they call it in their terms, a very peaceful place, and people are having happy life. If that's true, why don't they just let those, international independent journals or organizations just go freely and to do the investigation and talk to the locals there? So when it comes to this disinformation part, I think CCP has a multi-layered, very complex approach. And distorting the truth is one, and then, refuting against the truth, which is spoken by the Uyghur community or other international, human rights NGOs is one. And also, the most importantly, kind of, silencing dissent voice, not only on the Uyghur issue, of course, but like in Hong Kong, Chinese human rights or Christian issues, Christian rights, Tibetans issues. So it has many angles that they always take it really seriously. Actually, when Xi Jinping, in his visit to the Uyghur region in July this year, said that, when it comes to this foreign propaganda, it has to be multi-layered, all-round, three-dimensional approach. So if you look at that, you say that it's not only from like written paper news media, not the traditional media, not only the digital one, but they wanted to put the face in front of those, the people that they don't really understand or they don't think that, there's the kind of, atrocity is going on. So I assume that, the CCP going forward, they have been doing this, and this foreign propaganda, disinformation approach will try to bring up more the Uyghurs to international stage. They did that at the UN, and also like several years ago when we have several Uyghur rights advocacy groups were visiting Indonesia and Malaysia, right after that, they sent the Islamic Association, the Uyghur regions, the chief guy, the Uyghur guy, who is a typical, speaks the typical CCP lines, just to make those visits. So, I mean, it's a mixture of like different ways. And then I'm also sure that not only they'll use these forums, they'll also use their diplomatic, political, economic, people-to-people exchange, all different layers of levels to do this disinformation. I just wanted to clarify that here I'm speaking of my personal capacity.
I also wanted to add to the disinformation comment. The CCP has a very sophisticated understanding of the American political spectrum, and they will sometimes pose as AAPI activists and say any criticism of the Chinese government is a racist act. And that, unfortunately, really dilutes AAPI discourse. It doesn't help the diverse AAPI community from actually progressing on any of our real issues. And as someone who's part Chinese and part Uyghur and grew up in the US, I think it's really tragic, and I hope we can build more allyship in this regard and have the AAPI issue, take up the Uyghur refugee issue. And I hope that every time I tweet about AAPI issue, I don't lose any more followers. But really, we need to start looking at it more by bipartisan perspective.
Thank you. I'd like to ask if someone would mind addressing the broader question as to the prospect of moving China to become more small d democratic, which was part of the premise of the Nixon-Kissinger visit to China and was crushed most recently in Tiananmen Square and Hong Kong.
I mean, I'll just say something before we turn it over to Tung Biao, who I know talks about this a lot, I don't think you have to even get that far to stop the genocide in Xinjiang. And I don't think we should be looking to get that far, right? Like, that's a huge challenge. If you even want to take on that challenge, which maybe you don't. And so I think like we should stay focused on stopping these mass atrocities of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang. And so I think that's really what we should be focused on, because I think trying to change regimes is probably really hard. But I'm going to turn it over to Tung Biao if we can.
Pushing for democratization in China.
Yeah, so so last year I had an online course with Professor Andrew Nathan, Will China Democratize? That's the title. And so we talk about the American human rights policy, and not only the United States, but the so-called free world, how they react, how they respond to the human rights violations and in China by the Chinese government. So there's a long story, but one thing really related here is the United States for the past 3 decades or more, or even like 5 decades, they assume that engaging in China, the World Trade Organization, let China in the international treaties, and that kind of economic liberalization will promote political liberalization, but that didn't happen. And so one lesson we should learn is we should not prioritize the trade or profit over human rights. And that kind of engagement without focus on human rights or promotion of democratization is really close to appeasement. It's really appeasement.
There's one phrase coined by a friend of many of us, Professor Maggie Lewis, who says we are in the era of post-engagement engagement. And this is what we're talking about here. Many of the strategies we've heard today from the panelists is what do we do now that the form of engagement that Tung Biao has discussed just didn't work. Rather than producing a democratized China, it produced the regime of Xi Jinping. It didn't work. What do we do now? And that's what we're all grappling with. So any final words from anyone? Yeah, go ahead.
What is there to do, or other steps that not just the United States government could take, but I think at least a half dozen governments that have, here we'll talk about Uyghur Americans, LPRs. I struggle to understand why, the US, Canada, Germany, Turkey, Australia, a few others have not, as a matter of priority, started efforts to gather the names. From to be clear, from people who are willing and comfortable bringing that information forward, to assemble a list of all of the missing family members of, for example, Uyghur Americans or LPRs, to say to Beijing, we want to know the whereabouts and the well-being and the status of these people. We've just spent the last couple of years watching, Canada, fill in the blank, choose your characterization, over the fate of the 2 Michaels. We're talking about hundreds and thousands of people, and I fail to understand why governments have not gathered this information and taken it to Beijing, which will almost certainly say the people in question are not citizens of your countries, go away, we're not having this conversation. But we also know from decades of experience across our communities that it's precisely those kinds of interventions that can not only find that kind of information, but also actually wind up freeing people. And, if nothing else, and the UN report speaks to this, I see no reason why there shouldn't be a full court press to do this, to reunite family members and to find people. This, from a protection perspective, this is just an absolute no-brainer.
Well, thanks very much. And just in wrapping up, again to channel Jerry Cohen, not only, I think, have we come from this conference much better educated, but I think we've also come from it energized and with specific ideas about what to do and how to translate what we've heard about today into some action, from tweeting on up. So thank you all very much.
I want to just add my thanks to the panel and to Martin for sharing. I think, you know, we've had a really good discussion the last few hours about what, why, what can we do? And sort of my takeaway summary is what we heard is there are severe and systematic human rights violations going on. And if you were a Uyghur, it could be your brother, it could be your sister, it could be your father, or it could be you. And I think that's where we started and that's where we want to end. And we've heard so much really painful personal experience. That's just a, you know, tip of the iceberg of what's happening. And then we tried to talk about why is this happening? And it seems like, as usual, it's complicated. There's religious reasons, there's political reasons, there's economic reasons. But again, I think we just need to keep it simple. And on the wall here, thank you, Martin, for pointing out that we're in the home of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt is famous, among other things, for these 4 freedoms. And the 4 freedoms are freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And those 4 freedoms really transformed through Eleanor Roosevelt in part into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So these are fundamental human rights, and I think it's been said a few times, you know, for many purposes, it doesn't matter whether they're crimes against humanity or genocide or both, as is often the case. You know, the important thing is that they're happening, and it's people that could be you or me or our brothers or sisters or parents or children. So the most important panel, I think, was this last discussion about what can we do, and I think lots of great ideas came out, which I really appreciate. You know, and just to review some of them, you know, refugees is obviously something that I think our country has generally been lacking in. We have the Statue of Liberty, you can go and read all of that, but when you look at the reality, it doesn't match up. I think that public pressure, you know, a lot of the things were discussed are more at the UN level or the government level, an investigative mechanism, really important. We can do our own part to try to push governments, to try to push the UN, but I think it was said there's no silver bullet. And whether we win or lose this fight for human rights really depends on us. And I particularly appreciate the discussion about consumer power. You know, that is just one of many ways in which you as an individual person can advocate for human rights. And I think in addition to consumer power, there's a political component of that as well. And now we have all the tools of social media. It's just really an incredible opportunity to get involved and to follow up on some of these ideas. And I guess I just want to end with this point about solidarity. I know there was a discussion about the different issues, you know, across China, but I think across the world. And this idea about the US, I mean, all of these governments, the US, China, these are superpower governments. They're very hard to move. Even Myanmar, not a superpower government, very hard to see a real difference in the lives of real people. And I think the more we can pull solidarity among all of us who care about human rights, regardless of what country, because that's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights really is. It's universal. It doesn't matter if it's China, US, Myanmar, Russia, Ukraine. Everybody has individual rights that need to be respected. And in most cases, you know, that's not what's happening. And it's really up to us to do whatever we can to build a global human rights movement that's powerful and effective. We have tools that we never had before. And I think, you know, especially being at a campus, we're relying on the next generation. I don't think we're us older human rights advocates so proud of what we've been able to accomplish, but I think that we're really looking to you, counting on you, and I have great faith in you. And I really want to thank all of our panelists, especially to be able to hear from so many people who are themselves Uyghur people with families and themselves who have just suffered so much. It's hard to share that. And I think that's a very motivating force for me and I think for all of us. So thanks to all of us. And please come upstairs and join us for a reception in the Four Freedoms room where we had the coffee break. And I just wanted to invite Sophie to say a few final words, if you like.
Hi, it's hard to improve on what Jessica just said, and if you haven't turned around and read what's on the wall behind you, it's pretty powerful to be sitting up here and reading that and feeling a need to get out and do more. We covered a huge amount of ground today, from the origins of atrocity crimes all the way through to what to do about it, and I too am grateful not just to our friends from the Uyghur community for their willingness again and again to courageously tell their stories, but to, Human Rights Watch has been working on these issues for 25 years, and all of the people who've had the confidence in us to share their stories with us. I am in awe, and I think every time it reminds us of the incredible human cost of violations. And, I'm hoping that today we've fulfilled Roosevelt House's mandate, to educate and to have a discussion and a debate about what abuses are and what to do about them, at a larger level, and what we can do as individuals and take those ideas forward out into the world. So some quick thanks. First of all, particularly to Jessica and to Roosevelt House and to Katrina Avila. I don't know where you are, hopefully here someplace, for all of your incredible hard work helping pull this together. To all of, even bigger thanks to all of the panelists today, friends, allies, great sparring partners. It's marvelous to have everybody together. But my sincerest thanks today go to my personal hero, Tang Biao, whose idea this gathering was, and who has fought and fought and fought on behalf of so many people, who has taught and taught and taught so many people, and who brings us together again and again to try to find solutions to big, hard questions. I'm really grateful that our paths have crossed, and thank you so much for bringing us together today.